is your darkest family secret that you could never tell anyone? Story 1. My mom earns six figures yet is a mistress for a millionaire I've known for 10 plus years. He regularly pays money into her account, drips of a few thousand a month. He has bought my grandparents things, bought me things. I pretend he's just a great and generous family friend, but I know she's flipping for cash. It's not even like she needs it. It's wild. Story 2. Not a secret, but still dark. In the Second World War, my grandfather stole an ID tag from a deceased Russian soldier. By doing that, he condemned him to anonymity and made his family not ever know what happened to him. I do not know why he did that, but it bothers me. Story 3. My grandfather had two families in the same town at the same time. The 1930 and 1940 census were very interesting. Of course, everyone in my mother's side, her father, denied it was the same person, but it was. Story 4. My father was always very distant when I was a child, and eventually my parents ended up getting divorced. I never really saw my dad again after that, but it was always odd to me. My parents never fought, argued, yelled, or anything. The house was always quiet, clean, and we were always well off. We eventually found out he passed away from word of mouth in 2020. My mom for the first time started sharing stories. Turns out he'd go completely silent sometimes, just absolutely mute. He would go to work, come home, and not speak or interact with anyone in the house. I was young, so I don't really remember. I was always curious as to why he would do that, because from my mom's stories it seemed to happen regularly. A few weeks ago, my mom told me a story of my dad and her being at dinner with my dad's parents and how his father, my grandpa, smacked my grandmother at the dinner table and everyone just continued like it was normal. Ever since I've heard this story, I've been trying to delve into my family's history, but it's been very hard to find anything. My theory is that there was some very heavy abuse going on, and my father probably suffered from some intense mental issues because of that. Story 5. My grandfather and his brothers, after a long-time conflict with Pashtun Kuchis, who are nomadic people, every season came and destroyed large parts of their crops with their livestock, decided to murder more than 10 Kuchi families by poisoning wells they used. Story 6. My great-uncle Donald terminated his ex-wife so he wouldn't have to pay child support and alimony. And then my great-grandma covered for him when the cops came to question him. She said that he was with her all night, and I guess it being back then and also in a small town, they didn't really question that hard about it. My grandpa said he was a kid when this happened, and he remembered hearing that while he was playing in the living room, and he was wondering why his mom was lying LOL. My great-uncle Donald is still alive to this day, and after terminating his ex-wife, he ended up abandoning his kid by dropping him off at his grandmother's house and never coming back. He also ended up having close relationship with a 16-year-old girl when he was like 50, and her mom allowed it to happen, hoping that he would sell her his horse ranch for a discounted price. But when he didn't do that, she reported him to cops, and he got arrested, and she was able to get the ranch at the end. Still messed up how she basically pimped out her minor daughter, but whatever. Anyway, he didn't serve time for that long though, and now he's out and doing scams to make ends meet. Story 7. TW. My stepdad isn't my little sister's dad. My mom was pregnant when she met my stepdad, and my whole family had a pact to not ever tell her. My stepdad knows too. My sister's real dad lives a couple doors down from where she lives now, and she doesn't even know. What's scary is my stepdad essayed me and my older sister, and we feel he did the same with her because she wasn't his. He eventually cheated on my mom with another woman who has younger daughters. We feel as if he went after her for the daughters. Story 8. My step-grandfather was sleeping with my mother for years. She was an addict, and he supplied her with pills that he stole from my great-grandmother. My mother had many affairs in my lifetime. This was not an affair. To this day, I cannot imagine what my mother was living with as this continued for years. It does say a lot about the power of addiction. It is believed that my grandmother knew about this situation, but sweeping it under the rug was the way they dealt with everything. I am 62 and still struggle with what I grew up in. My stepfather was an abuser also. As a 62-year-old woman, I have struggled with relationships, especially with men. Although I've been married for over 40 years, I still struggle with all things related to close relationship, never put your child in a position of your soundboard. All of this gave me a very warped view of relationships. Story 9. My uncle assaulted my aunt when she was a kid. He was old enough to know better. My mom caught him. We genuinely think he's a sociopath or something. Story 10. Have told someone this, but my grandmother's sister terminated her husband. She was married to him when he was over 10 years older and when she was around 16. He supposedly beat her and abused her for years, and she had enough. Story 11. My grandparents used to have this painting of a little blonde girl standing in a field, that to the sky above their couch, so me being an unpleasant person, decided to tell my little sister that she was the girl in the painting because we found her on the side of the road. She believed me for literal years. We had a good laugh after. By the way, Story 12. My brother groomed me and abused me in his bedroom at night when I was 10 and he was 15. He nearly assaulted me, but I had the sense to stop it. He pretends he doesn't remember, and his partner and mother of his two young girls stands by him. Story 13. I told my wife because it surfaced after my father terminated himself, but he was a recovering candy addict and alcoholic who was decently good at hiding his pill addiction during his last relapse. He eventually got a hold of some bad mix of something that fried his brain. He had no idea who anyone was, didn't recognize his granddaughter, and decided to terminate himself 3 days after my wedding. We only learned about his relapse because his closest friend was his supplier, until he ran out while in Mexico and got a hold of who knows what. Sweets are bad, Mick. Story 14. On the contrary, this comes up somewhat often. Grandfather was an American missionary in Manchuria during World War II. He ended up being driven out of the area due to Japanese forces moving in. One stray bullet from my great-uncle and I might not have been here. Definitely wild to think about. Story 15. I tell people now, close friends, and read it a time or two before on alts because it's a good story, lol. But didn't tell a soul for a couple decades in case it could get Grandpa in trouble for his old-school brand of vigilante justice against a horse stable trespasser. I was a horse, grew up on a horse farm with my grandparents. One night when I was 17, we were on a walk and heard a weird noise in one of the stables. My grandfather rushed over, gun in hand, to check it out. I followed. Sure enough, there was a guy in there who apparently had snuck in, getting frisky with one of the mares. He screamed and tried to pull his pants up and run, but when my grandpa yelled after him and he saw the gun, he stopped. My grandpa told him to sit down with his hands up. My grandpa talked to the guy about it and asked him why he was doing this. The guy begged and said he wasn't a bad person, had a job, cared for the poor, contributed to society. He's just had this weird struggle for a long time about horses and doesn't know why it's so appealing to him, but he doesn't want to harm anyone and begged Grandpa not to ruin his life. My grandpa was sympathetic to him and said he'd known people with addictions and weird, close relationship hang-ups and what society would do to him wouldn't be fair, but that he did need to stop and he had an idea to help him stop. So he gave him a choice. I can call the police and whatever comes of that for your life is going to happen. Or you can let me choose your punishment right here and no one will ever hear about this. It won't terminate you or maim you and you'll be out of here by tomorrow, but that's about all I can promise. You're not going to like it, but I think you need it. The guy, of course, chose the latter. My grandpa asked me to fetch him some rope and horse tack from the adjacent shed. He tightly bound the guy's hands together behind his back, led him to a stall with one of the horses in it, and helped him aboard, facing backwards. It was then I knew exactly what was going to happen, based on stories Grandpa had told me about some stories of past military punishments from his days in the army. Wasn't sure if they were just tall tales or really used back in the day on poor cavalry soldiers, but I knew it was about to become a reality for this guy. Grandpa made him start to bend his head down, using his hand to help, until the guy was bent over with his face an inch away from the horse's peach. He asked me to use my hand to keep his head in that position as he bound up the guy's legs, and then came back to use the rope to secure his neck, binding his head in place. He was quick about it too. Almost made me wonder if he'd practiced this before, lol. The guy, of course, was shocked and horrified, saying, "You, not this, please, I won't come back, I promise." He fought the restraints as best he could, but his face was quite stuck in the line of fire. His nose was no more than half an inch away from the horse butt, perfectly centered. My grandpa told him he'd be released the afternoon of the following day, nearly 12 to 15-hour punishment. He wasn't having his excuses. You wanted to be intimate with horses. I'm giving you what you wanted. You at least ought to know to stay on your own property and not scare people at night if you must indulge in this. But something tells me after tonight, you're not going to want to look at a horse for a very, very long time. I'm doing you a favor in the end. It was almost like the horse knew too. The guy called out, "You can't do this, Zarinia." And I kid you not, the very next second the tail went up and the horse let out the longest, nastiest sounded 12-second long horse fart. I immediately backed out of the stall and instinctively laughed. Looking back in, it was not a laughing matter for the guy. He immediately started gagging something horrific, making the worst disgust noises I'd heard, and promptly puked. Took him a solid 2 minutes to stop retching. And the horse was fine, of course. Many of the horses were used to carrying things strapped to them, like deer after hunts, etc. Certainly did not envy the guy being stuck there for hours. Oof. Story 16. My mom messed up strangers while Dad was at work. My sister and me were in the next room hearing it all. We were young, so hadn't had a clue what was going on. Story 17. My great-grandfather divorced my great-grandmother because he was screwing her daughter, his stepdaughter, who ended up birthing my father. They ended up forming a new family. It's pretty effed up, but at least it ain't incest, lol. He was a wealthy farm owner from old money and had too much leisure time living in a massive farm that was very rural and isolated. Story 18. My sister attempted at least 5 times but was always rescued. She is assisted living now but doesn't understand why she can't be free to have an apartment. She was valedictorian of her high school class. Story 19. My mom lied to everyone about being in the Marine Corps. The only people who know are me and my dad. I've tried to tell my sisters, but they honestly don't care to listen. For years, she participated in Veterans Day celebrations and played the sympathy card for years. She still talks to aspiring Marines about her struggles. She was even my friend's honorary first salute, and I don't have the heart to tell her that it was all fake. Story 20. My great-grandpa was an incredibly sweet, giving, loving man who immigrated from Germany. He passed away many years ago but is beloved by everyone in and out of the family. I was the only one permanently living nearby him, so I offered to go through his belongings and parcel them appropriately when he passed, as he didn't have a will. In one of his old chests buried deep in a closet no one sees, I found a whole collection of Nazi memorabilia, including a uniform, some badges, pictures of people I didn't recognize in Nazi uniforms, trinkets with Nazi imagery neatly wrapped in old felt, clearly an assortment of items that were cared about at some point. Clearly not a pile of old junk he collected. I kept it for about a year in my basement, waiting for someone in the family to ask about it or bring it up. Asked the family what he did in Germany. No one could tell me for sure. I double-bagged it all in contractor bags and threw it in a dumpster in town. I didn't want anyone else to suspect what I do. Story 21. My grandfather, whom I always knew as laid-back, funny, loving, and doting, used to get drunk and beat my grandmother. I overheard my mom say it during an argument she had with my grandmother. He was also 17 when he started dating, when she was 13. I was massively angry and disappointed in him when I found out, but they seem to have had a thriving marriage anyways. I haven't said anything because it's not my place nor business, but it still taught me that people and things are not always what they seem. Story 22. My mom runs an illegal ferret breeding rescue operation in California where they're banned. She has about 200 to 300 ferrets living in her home at any given point in time. Story 23. My dad stepped up to help with my uncle's kids after his passing. Uncle's oldest son needed rehab, and Dad told him he was taking it. Cousin didn't take that news very well, ran into the house and came back out a moment later, running toward Dad. My mom, a sweet, mild preacher's wife, realized the cousin had a knife behind his back. She ran and tackled him and got the knife away from him. The cousin did go to rehab and has been clean for over 20 years. He's done very well for himself. Story 20. Oh geez, which one? On Mom's side, my grandfather was adopted because his mom was Irish Catholic and pregnant out of wedlock. Not sure of the circumstances, but his dad was prominent in their state and had a daughter with his wife shortly beforehand. And the family that adopted my grandfather had a murder a few generations back in 1906. So, yeah, no wonder he was pissed about being given up for adoption. His adoptive parents were violent alcoholic enabler Holocaust deniers. My great-grandfather on the other side was a child, and everyone knew, but that's what his dad did, so surely it wasn't wrong, right? My great-grandmother covered for him. Although my granddad beat him up on the front lawn when my grandmother graduated college, so I guess there's that. On Dad's side, my minister grandfather had a long affair with the church secretary, eventually divorcing my grandmother over it. But I haven't seen that side since I was 9 because my dad likes to throw hands, so who knows what else? Oh, and let's not talk about my cousin trying to sleep with me when we were teenagers, or my mom marrying a convicted that one time without realizing it, or someone back in the line being pardoned by the governor of Kentucky for Ku Kluxing. Throw in substance abuse, mental illnesses, violence, estrangement, you name it. Yay! Story 25. My brother committed a period. I helped my mother and sister pick up the pieces. They both viewed me as somebody very safe and responsible and comforting, and nobody in the family has ever found out that I failed to complete my own attempt years before he did, spending 4 days in hospital and 2 months off sick. He was always better at things than me. Story 26. My grandmother was kicked out of Ireland with her father when she was a little girl. The way she explained it, her father was labeled too extreme for the IRA. I laughed it off until my father and I visited Ireland during a golf vacation and approached a local historical expert to research a bit of our family history. They got wide eyes when we mentioned great-grandfather's name and said we shouldn't tell another soul about our relatives. Story 27. My 11-year-old older half-brother had close relationship with his 9-year-old cousin when he was 16. When I was 10 and he was 21, my parents found pictures of 9-year-old girls on his computer. 3 girlfriends have left him because they thought he acted weird around their kids and his own daughter. Our mom, who granted had a brain tumor at the time, was convinced he was a pedo as well, and the last thing she said while lucid was, "Give up on him, protect the kids." Cops have always said there's no proof and no legal course of action. But we all flipping know. Telling others would do no good, though, other than ruin my niece's life even further. So we don't talk about it and pretend it didn't happen. Helps that we all contact with him back in 2007. Story 28. My mom was to the sky during her bouts of manic depression. During one of her flip-outs, she threw a hammer presumably at my dad, but my 3-year-old face got in the way. Story 29. After my mother found out that her husband was infertile, she decided to have 6 children with her father-in-law. On top of that, she brainwashed her husband, my legal dad, for years into believing the diagnosis of infertility was wrong and had him raise us as his children. Story 30. Dad would take me for ice cream on weekends, made sure I had a pocket full of toy soldiers. We'd go to apartment buildings and I'd get left in the lobby, which at the time always had planters with plastic plants and furniture like couches and chairs, while he went into an apartment and got shagged. I'd be by myself for a half hour, 45 minutes, I guess, and he'd come out with some woman all clingy who might say hi to me, but usually not. He had 4 on rotation after we'd get ice cream, and I'd get told this was our secret. Started when I was maybe 7 or 8, went on until we moved across the country 3 years later. Story 31. Great uncle was a loan shark in a very big case with a notorious FBI most wanted because he saw some murders. My mom cheated on me dad with a level 3 close relationship offender. My grandfather was part of Murder Inc., the strong-arm part of the Italian mafia. We only found out after he passed away because we found lockboxes with casino chips from casinos my grandmother had never been to, keys to places we don't know about, and pictures of him in Havana riding a motorcycle. He never rode stateside or told anyone about this. My mother, who was an attorney and has access to special deep background checks, ran one on my grandfather to handle his estate and found an entire second family we've never heard of. He also had a falling out with a family member over business. And so there's a bunch of family I've never met. My brother straight up asked my grandmother if my grandfather was in the mob, and she said that everyone in the neighborhood was back in the day. Both of them are from the garment district of Brooklyn. Story 33. My dad had an affair with a boy from my grade when I was a freshman in high school. Mom found out and dad went to jail for the second time from doing this. When he got out, he got sick and passed away alone in the hospital. Nobody talks about it to this day. Story 34. My sister thinks she is happily married for over 50 years, when in reality she is married to a who spikes women's drinks and enjoys what happens afterwards. Story 35. My uncle was a molester who me and some of the girls inside and outside of the family. I still see him in family functions, and I am pretty sure one day he'll create scene where I will scream at him and the family for protecting him and ruining my relation with men. Story 36. A girl I dated had an uncle who went off to college when she was a little girl. Seems like he went to college for 4 years for candy possession, but got his degree early for time served and good behavior. Story 37. Several people assaulted or by another cousin or uncle, but didn't find out years later. It's why I do not trust anyone, not even family alone with my kids. Story 38. Ooh, there is a lovely public radio show about family secrets. One of the guests, Michael Haney, discovered that his father had passed away in the apartment of his mistress. He is a proponent of family secrets being shared. And when he said this, it really stuck with. The point of life is not closure, it's openness. Listen. Story 39. Honestly, the darkest family secret is that nobody knows we're secretly competitive about everything. Like, we could be on some reality TV show about families who secretly battle it out on board games, cooking contests, and even who can stay the quietest the longest. It's all fun and games until someone brings up Monopoly. Then, it's war. Not exactly scandalous, but if the family knew I shared our intense competitive streak online, I'd never hear the end of it. Story 40. My aunt was assaulted in her sleep by her half-brother as a child and only found out when she was in bed with her husband. For her, the memories of the abuse were just childhood nightmares, and when my grandfather found out, he swore his son would pass away. Story 41. My dad told me on his deathbed that he overheard his mom and grandma talk about how my grandpa and great-uncles would bang my other great-uncle, their youngest brother, in the barn when they were all teenagers. Oh no. Story 42. Not a big one, but my dad once captured a protected bird and kept it in a small cage in his garage for years with poop towers building up. I was too young before it passed away to report him. I hate bird hunters with a passion, and they're a very influential community in my country. They make up less than 10% of the population, but they have all the political power. I'm too embarrassed to tell it to Amy, buddy. My likes keeping small birds in cages at home, sometimes so tiny that their wings get hurt. I've made my opinions of him very clear to him, and he got his feelings hurt. I've thought about reporting him multiple times, but A, the justice system here sucks. B, he's the main breadwinner of the family and I don't want to burden the rest with fines. And C, everyone would hate for driving a wedge between family. Story 43. Nobody in my father's life know me or my children exist, or that he used to physically and intellectually abuse me. He kicked me out when I was 15 and pregnant. He adores his stepdaughters and their children. Against my better judgment, I snooped about 2 years back. All of his friends were talking about how amazing he is, and my step-siblings talked about how good of a grandpa he is. Meanwhile, they have no idea about his biological daughter and grandkids that he discarded like trash. Story 44. I'm 42 and found out recently that my father has a list of dirty secrets. He got a girl pregnant right before meeting my mom. He had absolutely nothing to do with his son. I have a half-brother that I didn't know existed or how to even try to find it. Then I found out that when my dad was a kid, his parents took him on vacation to some lake. One of the kids there he didn't get along with. The kid went missing. Everyone was searching. His body washed up on shore. My dad drowned him. It was deemed an accident. He's a monster. Story 45. Not a dark, but it's still pretty sus. My great-grandmother might have had an affair with her brother-in-law, who might be the real father of my grandfather. Story 46. Older brother assaulted sister and I as kids. Now that we are adults, I first hear his son, my nephew, allegedly a sibling. Some years later, my nephew then tells me there were stories about me. After some sleuthing and confrontation, I got an apology from a niece. The other went dark. I didn't tell our mom due to age. I think their mother, SIL, was making a play for mom's house, in older brother's name, and was trying to break up family and cause chaos. Super long and painful experience. Stopped when I threatened legal action.